And what kind of life is this uncle offering her? Jacob's voice was deadly quiet, and both Miguel and Hawkins recognized the dangerous tone. Because if he cared so much about her welfare, where was he when she was dying alone on a frontier road? That ain't your concern, Hawkins snapped, losing some of his earlier confidence in the face of Jacob's obvious anger. The law is the law, and blood relatives have rights that strangers don't. Jacob's hand moved closer to his gun, and he heard Miguel's boots shift in the gravel behind him, taking a position where he could cover Jacob's back if shooting started. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the other riders began spreading out around the yard, clearly preparing for violence. But before anyone could draw a weapon, the front door of the house opened with a loud creak, and Emma stepped onto the porch. She moved slowly and deliberately, her crutch clicking against the wooden boards. But her small chin was raised with a dignity that would have made royalty proud. She had heard every word of the conversation, and Jacob could see both fear and determination warring in her young face. "I'm Emma Patterson," she said in a clear, steady voice that carried across the yard despite her obvious terror. "And I don't want to go with you." Sheriff Hawkins looked her up and down with obvious distaste, and Jacob saw the man's lip curl slightly as he took in her disability. "What you want doesn't matter, girl. You're property of your uncle now, and he has legal claim to you." "Why?" Emma asked with the simple directness of a child who had learned to face hard truths. "What does my uncle want with me? He never wrote to Mama or Papa when they were alive. He never sent help when Papa was dying or when Mama was sick. Why does he suddenly care about me now?" One of the deputies, a younger man who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the whole situation, shifted nervously in his saddle. "Tell her, Sheriff," he said quietly, his conscience apparently getting the better of him. Hawkins shot the deputy a warning look that could have melted steel. But Emma had caught the exchange with the sharp intelligence that had helped her survive so much already. "Tell me what?" The sheriff's jaw tightened as he realized his carefully constructed story was beginning to unravel. "Your uncle runs a business back in Illinois. He takes in orphan children and finds them honest work. Good character-building work that will teach you valuable skills." "What kind of work?" Jacob demanded, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer, and the thought made his stomach turn. "Factory work, mostly. Textile mills. The children earn their keep and learn the value of honest labor," Hawkins replied, but his tone lacked conviction, and Jacob could see the lie in his eyes. Jacob felt physically ill as the full horror of the situation became clear to him. He had heard whispers about such places where children were essentially sold into slavery, worked 14 hours a day in dangerous conditions for nothing more than a place to sleep and barely enough food to keep them alive. The idea of Emma, with her gentle spirit and physical limitations, being subjected to such brutal treatment was more than he could bear. "She's not going," Jacob said again, and this time his voice carried a finality that the dust kicked up by Jacob Mollister's horse settled slowly in the still afternoon air as he pulled the reins, bringing his mare to a gentle stop. Something had caught his eye along the weathered dirt road that stretched endlessly across the Texas plains, something that didn't belong in this desolate stretch of wilderness. There, beneath the sparse shade of a stunted mesquite tree, sat a small figure hunched over, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Jacob dismounted slowly, his weathered boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. At 43, he had seen his share of hardship on these frontier lands, but the sight of a child alone in the middle of nowhere stirred something deep in his chest. As he approached, he could see it was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with tangled auburn hair and a faded blue dress that had seen better days. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a makeshift crutch lay beside her in the dust. "Hey there, little miss," Jacob said softly, removing his worn hat and kneeling down to her level. "Why are you sitting here all by yourself?" The girl looked up with tear-stained cheeks and eyes the color of sage grass. Fear flickered across her face before she seemed to decide he wasn't a threat. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "They left me," she said simply, as if those 2 words contained all the sorrow in the world. Jacob felt his jaw tighten. "Who left you, child?" "The wagon train. They said I was slowing them down too much with my bad leg." She gestured to her twisted limb with a matter-of-fact acceptance that broke Jacob's heart. "Mama died of the fever 3 days ago, and Papa died before we even started the journey. The wagon master said they couldn't wait for me anymore." The weight of her words settled over Jacob like a heavy blanket. He had heard stories of wagon trains abandoning the weak and sick, but to see it firsthand, to see a helpless child cast aside like unwanted cargo, filled him with a rage that burned hotter than the Texas sun. But he kept his voice gentle and calm. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma." "Emma Patterson." She looked down at her hands, which were scratched and dirty from trying to walk on the rough ground with her crutch. "Are you going to leave me, too?" The question hit Jacob like a physical blow. He thought of his own ranch, 20 miles south, where he lived alone except for his hired hand, Miguel. He thought of the hard life he led, the cattle to tend, the land to work, the isolation that had become his companion since his wife died 5 years ago. Taking in a disabled child would change everything, complicate everything. But looking into Emma's eyes, he knew there was really no choice at all. "No, Emma. I'm not going to leave you." He stood up and extended his hand to her. "My name is Jacob and I have a ranch not far from here. You're going to come home with me." Emma stared at his outstretched hand as if it were the most precious thing she had ever seen. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and placed her small fingers in his calloused palm. Jacob helped her to her feet and handed her the crutch, then lifted her onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode toward his ranch, Emma remained quiet, but Jacob could feel some of the tension leave her small body as she leaned back against his chest. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for the first time in years, Jacob felt something other than loneliness in his heart. The ride to the ranch took nearly 2 hours through the rugged Texas landscape. Jacob found himself stealing glances at the small child in front of him, marveling at her quiet strength. She hadn't cried once since he'd lifted her onto his horse, though he could feel the occasional tremor that ran through her slight frame. The crutch she clutched was clearly homemade, carved from a piece of oak and worn smooth from use, suggesting she had been dealing with her disability for quite some time. As they crested a low hill, the ranch came into view below them. It wasn't much to look at, Jacob supposed, especially through the eyes of a child who had been expecting to reach the promised land of California. The house was a simple log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The barn was larger and newer, built to house the 30 head of cattle that represented Jacob's life's work. Corrals stretched out behind the barn, and a vegetable garden grew beside the house, tended by Miguel's careful hands. "Is that your home?" Emma asked, speaking for the first time since they'd left the roadside. "It is. Been here for 12 years now, ever since I came back from the war." Jacob guided his horse down the gentle slope toward the buildings. "It's not fancy, but it's sturdy and warm, and there's always enough food on the table." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood that in her current situation, sturdy and warm were luxuries beyond measure. Miguel Hernandez, a weathered man in his 50s who had worked for Jacob for over a decade, came out of the barn when he heard the horses approaching. His dark eyes widened when he saw the child perched in front of his boss, and Jacob could see the questions forming in the older man's mind. Miguel had fought alongside Jacob in the war between the states, and the two men had developed an understanding that went beyond employer and worker. They were friends, brothers in all but blood, and Miguel knew that Jacob didn't make impulsive decisions. "Patron, who is this little one?" Miguel asked in his accented English, immediately moving to help Emma down from the horse with the gentle care he had once shown his own children. "This is Emma," Jacob said, dismounting and handing the reins to Miguel. "She'll be staying with us." Miguel asked no further questions, though Jacob caught the flicker of concern in his old friend's eyes. Miguel had lost his own wife and youngest daughter to cholera 2 years ago, and Jacob knew that the sight of a child in need would stir painful memories. But Miguel had learned long ago that Jacob was a man of deep conviction beneath his quiet exterior. If he said the child would stay, then she would stay, and Miguel would do everything in his power to help make that happen. "Are you hungry, Mia?" Miguel asked, his voice taking on the gentle tone he had once used with his own children, now grown and scattered across the territories. "I was just preparing supper. Nothing fancy, but it will fill your stomach." Emma nodded shyly, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness she was being shown. After 3 days of eating nothing but the few scraps of hardtack she had managed to salvage from the wagon train, the promise of a real meal seemed almost too good to be true. The interior of Jacob's house was simple but clean, with whitewashed walls and sturdy furniture that had been built to last. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and a wooden table sat in the center, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs. Emma noticed immediately that everything was neat and orderly, but there was a sense of emptiness about the place, as if it had been a home once but had become merely a shelter. That night, as they sat around the table sharing beans, cornbread, fresh milk from Jacob's cow, and coffee, Emma ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. But despite her obvious need, her manners were impeccable, suggesting she had been raised in a loving home before tragedy struck her family. "Mama," Jacob said gently, setting down his coffee cup and studying the child's face in the lamplight. "Can you tell us about your family? Where were you all headed before?" Emma set down her spoon carefully and looked up at him with those solemn sage, green eyes that seemed to hold far too much wisdom for someone so young. "We were going to California. Papa had a brother there who wrote and said he could get Papa work in the gold fields around Sacramento. Papa said we were going to have a new start, maybe even get a little piece of land of our own someday." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and Jacob could see her fighting back tears as she continued. "But Papa got sick with the lung fever before we even reached Kansas. He fought it for 2 weeks, but he just kept getting weaker and weaker. Mama tried everything she knew, all the remedies her own mama had taught her, but nothing helped." Emma's voice grew smaller. "He died on a Tuesday morning just as the sun was coming up. I remember because I was holding his hand, and I felt it when he just stopped breathing." Miguel crossed himself quietly, murmuring a prayer in Spanish, while Jacob felt his chest tighten with sympathy for the child's loss. "Mama tried to be strong after that," Emma continued, "but I could see how scared she was. She didn't know anything about driving the oxen or fixing the wagon when it broke down. And then she started getting the fever too. She tried to hide it from me, but I could see how her hands shook and how she couldn't keep food down." Emma looked down at her plate, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "She made me promise that if something happened to her, I would be brave and find a way to take care of myself. She said I was stronger than I knew." "And your leg?" Jacob asked softly, dreading the answer but needing to understand what this child had endured. Emma looked up at him with that matter-of-fact acceptance that continued to amaze him. "I was born this way. The cord got wrapped around me before I was born," Mama said, "and it hurt my leg. The doctor back in Missouri said it would never work right, but Mama always told me I was made special for a reason. She said I had to be extra strong in my heart and mind because my leg couldn't be strong." Her eyes brightened slightly. She was right too. I was always better than the other children at taking care of the animals and knowing when they were sick or scared or hurt. Miguel and Jacob exchanged a meaningful look over the child's head. Both men had seen enough of life to recognize true strength when they encountered it, and this little girl had survived more hardship and loss than many grown men ever would. The fact that she could speak of her parents' deaths and her own abandonment with such composure, while still maintaining her essential kindness and hope, spoke to an inner resilience that commanded their deepest respect. Over the following days and weeks, Emma began to settle into the rhythm of life on the ranch. Jacob had initially intended to give her his own bedroom and sleep in the main room, but Emma had quietly insisted that she would be perfectly comfortable in the small storage room off the kitchen. With Miguel's help, they cleaned it out and converted it into a proper bedroom, complete with a narrow bed, a small table, and hooks on the wall for her few possessions. Rosa Hernandez, Miguel's wife, lived in town but came out to the ranch twice a week to help with the heavier cleaning and to bake bread and preserve food for the winter months ahead. When she first met Emma, the middle-aged woman's maternal instincts immediately took over. She clucked over the child's thin frame and the poor condition of her clothes, and within a week had appeared with bundles of fabric in her sewing basket. "This child needs proper dresses," Rosa announced in her mixture of Spanish and English, holding up Emma's faded blue dress and shaking her head disapprovingly, "and shoes that fit, and a warm coat for winter." Dios mío, what were those people thinking? Leaving a child with nothing. Under Rosa's caring attention, Emma began to bloom like a desert flower after rain. The older woman taught her to cook simple meals, showed her how to tend the vegetable garden, and treated her with the warm maternal affection that Emma had been desperately missing since her mother's death. But it was with the animals that Emma truly came alive. Despite her physical limitations, she moved through the corrals and pastures with a confidence and grace that amazed both Jacob and Miguel. She seemed to have an almost mystical connection with every creature on the ranch, from the massive draft horses that pulled the wagon to the smallest barn cat that kept the mice away from the grain. Within her first week at the ranch, Emma had proven her mother's words about her special gift. She spotted a lame horse that both men had missed, correctly predicted which of the pregnant cows would have difficulty calving, and somehow managed to calm a spooked steer that had been terrorizing the other cattle for days. "She has the Don," Miguel told Jacob one evening as they watched Emma sitting in the main corral, completely surrounded by horses who had gathered around her as if she were holding court. "My grandmother back in Sonora had it too. Animals trust her completely. Like she speaks their language." Jacob nodded, watching as Emma laughed at something one of the horses did, the sound like music floating across the quiet ranch. It had been years since he had heard genuine laughter on his land, and he was beginning to realize how much he had missed it. The ranch had felt like a tomb since Margaret's death, a place where he went through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. But Emma's presence was changing all of that, bringing warmth and joy back into corners that had been cold and dark for too long. As the autumn months progressed, and the first hints of winter began to touch the Texas plains, the three of them fell into a comfortable and meaningful routine. Emma would rise early with Jacob and Miguel, helping with the morning chores as much as her disability allowed. She couldn't lift heavy buckets or handle the larger animals, but she had a dozen other ways of making herself useful. She gathered eggs from the chickens, fed the smaller animals, and kept careful watch over the cattle, alerting the men to any problems she observed. In the afternoons, while Jacob and Miguel worked on the more physically demanding ranch tasks, Emma would spend time in the kitchen with Rosa when she was there, learning to bake bread and preserve vegetables for the harsh winter months ahead. When Rosa wasn't at the ranch, Emma would settle at the kitchen table with the few books Jacob owned, teaching herself to read with a determination that impressed him greatly. The evenings were perhaps the most precious time of all. After supper, they would gather around the fireplace, and Jacob would help Emma with her reading, sounding out difficult words and explaining their meanings. Miguel would tell stories of his childhood in Mexico, painting vivid pictures of festivals and family gatherings that made Emma's eyes shine with wonder. Sometimes Emma would share memories of her parents, and slowly, painfully, Jacob found himself talking about his late wife Margaret and the dreams they had shared for their ranch and their future together. It was during one of these quiet evenings in late October that Emma first broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. "Jacob," she said quietly, setting down the book she had been struggling through, "what's going to happen to me when winter comes?" The question caught Jacob off guard, though he realized he should have expected it. Emma was a bright child, and she had undoubtedly been thinking about her uncertain future. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, are you going to try to find me a real family? People who might want to adopt me?" Emma's voice was carefully controlled, but Jacob could hear the fear beneath her calm words. "I know I'm not really your daughter, and I know taking care of me is extra work and expense that you didn't plan for." Jacob set down his own coffee cup and looked directly into Emma's eyes. "Emma, do you want to stay here, with Miguel and me?" The child's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "I want to stay more than anything, but I know I'm not easy to take care of with my bad leg and everything. And I know you never asked for a daughter." "You listen to me, Emma Patterson," Jacob said firmly, getting up from his chair and kneeling down beside her. "I may not have asked for a daughter, but I can't imagine my life without you now. You've brought more joy and purpose to this ranch in 3 months than I've felt in 5 years. And as for your leg, that doesn't make you a burden. It makes you unique and special, just like your mama said." Miguel cleared his throat gently. "Nita, when I lost my little Maria to the cholera, I thought my heart would never heal. But watching you here, seeing how you care for the animals and bring laughter to this place, it has helped heal something broken inside me. You are not a burden to anyone. You are a gift." Emma threw her arms around Jacob's neck, sobbing with relief and joy. "I love you, Jacob. I love you and Miguel and Rosa and this ranch. I never want to leave." "Then you won't," Jacob said simply, holding the child close and feeling his own eyes grow moist. "We'll make it legal and proper, but as far as I'm concerned, you've been my daughter since the day I found you by that road." but their peaceful existence was destined to be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. It was on a cold December morning, with frost covering the ground and their breath visible in the crisp air, that trouble came riding into their yard in the form of 6 mounted men. Jacob was in the barn, helping Miguel repair a broken stall door, when they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Both men immediately tensed, hands moving instinctively toward the weapons they always carried. Unexpected visitors in this remote area were rarely good news. Jacob stepped out of the barn to see the riders approaching, led by a thin man with cold blue eyes and a sheriff's badge pinned to his heavy winter coat. The other men looked like hired guns rather than legitimate deputies, and Jacob felt his blood begin to run cold as he considered what their presence might mean. "You Jacob McAllister?" the sheriff asked without preamble, dismounting and approaching with an aggressive swagger that immediately put Jacob on guard. "I am. What can I do for you?" "Sheriff." Jacob kept his voice level and his hand near his gun. "Sheriff Hawkins from Millerville," the man said, his eyes scanning the ranch buildings with obvious calculation. "I understand you're harboring a child that doesn't belong to you." A crippled girl named Emma Patterson. Jacob's heart began pounding, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. From the corner of his eye, he could see Miguel emerging from the barn, and he knew his friend would be ready to fight if necessary. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't play ignorant with me, McAllister. We know you took in that girl without any legal right to do so." Hawkins smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression, only cold calculation. "Turns out she's got family back east, an uncle who's been looking for her, real concerned about her welfare." From inside the house, Jacob could hear the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, and he knew Emma was listening from the window. He could only imagine how terrified she must be, hearing that the safety and security she had found was about to be torn away from her once again. "The child was abandoned," Jacob said carefully, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to handle this situation without putting Emma in danger. "Left to die on the roadside by people who considered her a burden. I gave her shelter because it was the right thing to do." "That may be, but the law is the law," Hawkins replied, though his tone suggested he cared very little about actual justice. "Her uncle is her rightful guardian, and he wants her back. He's even willing to pay a substantial reward for her safe return." The pieces began falling into place in Jacob's mind, and he felt a surge of anger so intense it took all his self-control not to draw his gun immediately. "And I suppose this generous uncle is also willing to pay you a finder's fee for tracking her down." Hawkins's smile widened. "Smart man. Now, we can do this easy, or we can do this hard. But either way, that girl is coming with us. And what kind of life is he offering her?" Jacob's voice was deadly quiet, because if he cared so much about her welfare, where was he when she was dying on the roadside? "That ain't your concern. The law is the law." Sheriff Hawkins nodded to his men, who began to spread out around the yard. "Bring the girl out, or we'll come in and get her." Jacob's hand moved to his gun, and he heard Miguel's boots shift in the dirt behind him. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. But before anyone could draw a weapon, the front door opened behind Jacob, and Emma stepped onto the porch. She moved slowly, her crutch clicking against the wooden boards, but her small chin was raised with dignity that would have made a queen proud. She had heard everything, and Jacob could see the fear in her eyes, but also a determination that surprised him. "I'm Emma Patterson," she said in a clear, steady voice. "And I don't want to go with you." Sheriff Hawkins looked her up and down with obvious distaste. "What you want don't matter, girl. You're coming with us." "Why?" Emma asked simply. "What does my uncle want with me? He never wrote to Mama or Papa when they were alive. He never sent help when Papa was dying. Why does he want me now?" One of the sheriff's men, a younger deputy who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, shifted in his saddle. "Tell her." "Sheriff," he said quietly. Hawkins shot the deputy a warning look, but Emma had caught the exchange. "Tell me what?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Your uncle. He's got a business. He takes in children, orphans and such, and finds them work. Good honest work." "What kind of work?" Jacob demanded, and something in his tone made the sheriff take a step back. "Factory work, mostly. Mill work. The children earn their keep, learn valuable skills." Jacob felt sick. He had heard about such places, where children were essentially sold into labor, worked like slaves in dangerous conditions for nothing more than a roof over their heads and barely enough food to survive. The idea of Emma, With her bad leg and gentle spirit, being subjected to such a fate made his vision blur with rage. "She's not going," Jacob said again, his voice like steel. "You can't stop us, McAllister. We got the law on our side. Do you?" A new voice said from behind the sheriff's men. Everyone turned to see Judge William Sterling riding into the yard, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. Judge Sterling was a well-respected circuit judge who traveled through the territory, and Jacob had dealt with him before on various land disputes. He was known as a fair man who actually cared about justice. Sheriff Hawkins paled slightly. "Judge Sterling, what brings you out here?" "Funny thing, Sheriff. I was in Millerville yesterday when I heard an interesting story about a man who was paying substantial sums to track down orphan children for their supposed relatives." Judge Sterling dismounted and approached the group, his keen eyes taking in the scene. "So I did a little investigating into this uncle of yours." The judge pulled out a piece of paper from his coat. "Turns out this William Patterson fellow runs what he calls an industrial training facility for children. Also turns out he's wanted in 3 states for child endangerment and operating what amounts to a slave labor camp." Sheriff Hawkins's face went white. "I didn't know. He said he was the girl's uncle. Oh, I'm sure he did for a price." Judge Sterling's voice was heavy with disgust. "And I'm sure he paid you well to look the other way and not ask too many questions." The judge turned to Emma, his expression softening. "Hello, child. I'm Judge Sterling. I understand you've been living here with Mr. McAllister." Emma nodded, instinctively moving closer to Jacob. "Yes, sir. He saved me. They left me to die. But he saved me." Judge Sterling looked around the ranch, taking in the well-maintained buildings, the healthy animals, and most importantly, the obvious care and affection between Jacob, Miguel, and Emma. "And how have you been treated here?" "Like family," Emma said without hesitation. "Jacob teaches me to read, and Miguel tells me stories, and Rosa brings me new dresses. They take care of me, and I help take care of the animals." The judge nodded slowly. "Mr. McAllister, I assume you'd like to make this arrangement official." Jacob looked down at Emma, who was gazing up at him with hope shining in her eyes. In the months since he'd found her on that dusty road, she had brought light and laughter back into his life, in ways he hadn't thought possible. She had healed something broken in his heart, just as he had provided her with safety and love. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to adopt Emma, if she'll have me." Emma dropped her crutch and threw her arms around Jacob's waist, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I want to stay. You're my family now." Judge Sterling smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. "Then it's settled. I hereby grant temporary custody to Jacob McAllister, pending formal adoption proceedings." He turned to Sheriff Hawkins, his expression hardening again. "A's for you, Sheriff. I suggest you head back to Millerville and start explaining to the townspeople how you nearly sold a child into slavery." Hawkins and his men rode away in disgrace, leaving behind a ranch filled with joy and relief. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table celebrating with a special meal Rosa had prepared, Emma looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family. "Jacob," she said quietly. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mama and Papa would be happy about me staying here with you?" Jacob reached across the table and took her small hand in his. "I think they would be very happy, Emma. They would want you to be loved and safe, and that's exactly what you are here." As winter gave way to spring, Emma continued to flourish on the ranch. Her special gift with animals proved invaluable during calving season, as she could predict which cows would have difficult births and when intervention was needed. Word of her abilities spread throughout the territory, and neighboring ranchers began seeking her advice on their sick or troubled animals. Jacob found himself amazed daily by Emma's resilience and wisdom. Despite all she had endured, she maintained a positive spirit and an unwavering faith in the goodness of people. She had even forgiven the wagon master who had abandoned her, saying that fear made people do terrible things sometimes, but that didn't make them terrible people. One warm May evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Emma turned to Jacob with a serious expression. "Jacob, I've been thinking about something." "What's that, sweetheart?" "There might be other children out there like me. Children who need help, who need a family." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe we could help them too. Not adopt them all, but maybe we could have a place where children could come when they need help, where they could learn to work with animals and feel safe." Jacob looked at his daughter, for that's truly what she had become, with wonder and pride. At 9 years old, She was already thinking about helping others, about using her gift to make the world a better place. That's a beautiful idea, Emma. It would be a lot of work, and we'd need more space, more help. Miguel's sons could help, Emma said eagerly. Rosa told me they're good with animals too, and they need work. And we could build another building, maybe near the south pasture where the ground is level. Over the following months, Jacob and Emma began planning what would become known throughout the territory as the McAllister Ranch Home for Children. They would take in orphaned and abandoned children, teach them valuable skills working with livestock, and help them find permanent homes or, in some cases, provide them with a permanent home themselves. The first child they took in was a 10-year-old boy named Tommy, whose parents had died in a cholera outbreak. He was angry and frightened, lashing out at anyone who tried to help him. But Emma, with her patient wisdom and understanding of what it felt like to be abandoned and afraid, slowly drew him out. She taught him to gentle horses and milk cows, and gradually his anger gave way to purpose and belonging. More children followed Sarah, who had been living on the streets after running away from an abusive stepfather, Marcus, a freed slave child whose parents had died before they could reach the safety of the Northern Territories, and little Mary, who had been born with a withered arm and abandoned by parents who saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. Each child brought their own pain and challenges, but Emma seemed to have an infinite capacity for understanding and healing. She became not just Jacob's daughter, but a sister and teacher to all the children who found their way to the ranch. Years passed, and the McAllister Ranch Home for Children became known throughout Texas and beyond as a place of hope and healing. Judge Sterling visited regularly, often bringing children who needed placement, and always marveling at the transformation he saw in both the children and the ranch itself. On Emma's 16th birthday, as she stood in the middle of a corral surrounded by a dozen children of various ages, all of them working with horses under her gentle guidance, Jacob reflected on the amazing journey that had brought them to this point. The frightened, abandoned little girl he had found crying by the roadside had grown into a remarkable young woman, one whose compassion and strength had touched hundreds of lives. That evening, after the birthday celebration had ended and the children were in bed, Emma and Jacob sat on the porch as they had so many times before. The ranch was quiet except for the gentle lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through the grass. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" Emma asked, her voice thoughtful. Jacob considered the question seriously. "I know what would have happened to you, and it breaks my heart to think about it. But as for me, I think I would have lived, but I wouldn't have really been alive. You gave me back my purpose, Emma. You taught me that sometimes the most broken things can become the most beautiful when they're given love and care." Emma smiled, the same gentle smile that had been healing hearts for 7 years. "You saved me first, Jacob, and then you taught me how to save others." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky, both of them knew that their story was far from over. There would be more children who needed help, more hearts that needed healing, more lives that could be transformed by the simple act of caring. The little girl who had once sat crying alone by a dusty road had become a beacon of hope for countless others, proving that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can change not just one life, but many, and somewhere in the distance, another child might be sitting alone and afraid, waiting for someone to stop and ask, "Why are you sitting here?" Knowing that when that question came, it would be the beginning of their own journey toward healing, hope, and home. The McAllister Ranch Home for Children would continue for decades, long after Emma grew up and started a family of her own. But she never forgot the lesson Jacob had taught her that first day, that everyone deserves to be loved, to belong, and to know that they matter. It was a lesson that would echo through generations, carried forward by all the children whose lives were touched by the cowboy who stopped for a crying little girl and the woman she became. In the end, it wasn't the hardships or the struggles that defined their story, but the love that grew from an act of simple human kindness on a lonely stretch of Texas road. And that love, like the endless prairie sky above them, stretched on forever, touching every life it encountered and proving that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply someone who cares enough to stop and ask, "Why are you sitting here?" and then stays to help with whatever answer comes.